I was 37 years old, the afternoon my mother-in-law walked a realtor and a young couple through my own front door, past the porch swing my father-in-law used to sit in every single evening, with his coffee going cold in his hand, and told them, in a voice pitched just soft enough to sound kind, that I wouldn't be a problem. But this story really starts 3 years before that afternoon, in a hospital room that smelled like rubbing alcohol and lake water, because that's the week Desmond Calloway found out exactly what his family was capable of, and quietly made sure it would never matter again. My name is Ruth Calloway. I'm 37, and for 12 years I've worked as a title and escrow officer, which is a polite way of saying I spend my days reading the fine print on other people's houses so nobody gets robbed on closing day. I'm good at it. I'm careful. I read documents the way some people pray, slowly, and twice. That habit was about to matter more than anyone in my husband's family could have imagined. My mother-in-law, Marlene, told that realtor I wouldn't be a problem the way you'd mention a squeaky hinge, just something to work around, nothing worth raising your voice over. I didn't argue, I didn't even blink, but there was one thing Marlene didn't know, one thing her own husband had made absolutely certain of 3 years earlier, and hadn't told a single soul in that family, except me. I wasn't a guest in that lake house. I was the only person alive with the legal right to live in it for the rest of my life, whether it sold or not, whether anyone liked it or not, whether Marlene ever forgave me for it or not. 20 minutes after she said I wouldn't be a problem, that realtor's pen would stop moving mid-signature. And by the end of that summer, Marlene would be the one packing boxes nobody asked her to pack. Nobody saw any of it coming from quiet, careful Ruth, who'd spent her whole career making sure other people's paperwork was airtight and had finally, 3 years too late for anyone to stop her, made sure her own was too. Welcome back to the channel, where the quiet ones in every family finally get to tell you the whole thing, calmly, start to finish. If a slow kind of justice is your thing, get comfortable. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. And if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe. Let me back up. Cedar Lake sits about 90 minutes north of where I grew up, a long freckle of water ringed with pine and a scattering of cabins that have been in the same families since the 50s. The Calloways have had their place on the East Shore for 3 generations. It's not fancy. It's a 2-story clapboard house the color of wet sand, with a dock that needs reboarding every few springs and a porch deep enough to sleep on in July. Desmond Calloway's father built the first version of it with his own hands in 1961, and Desmond spent every summer of his life adding onto it, board by board, like the house was a sentence he never quite finished writing. He added the screened-in section off the kitchen the year Sam was born. He rebuilt the boathouse himself after an ice storm took the roof clean off in the 90s. Every plank of that place had a story attached to it, and Desmond was the only one who still remembered most of them. I married into the Calloway family 9 years ago. Sam Calloway proposed to me on that same porch, down on one knee on the same warped board his grandfather always meant to replace and never did. I loved that house before I loved most of the people attached to it, and that's not something I'm proud of. But it's the truth, and this whole story runs on the truth, so I'm going to keep telling it plainly. Marlene never fully accepted me. It wasn't loud. Marlene doesn't do loud. It was smaller than that, and colder. It was the family portrait at Sam's cousin's wedding where I was asked, very sweetly, if I wouldn't mind being the one to take the photo, since I had such a steady hand. It was the year Sam's aunt got a hand-addressed Christmas card, and I got my name added in ballpoint to the bottom, under the printed greeting, like an afterthought stapled onto somebody else's holiday. It was the Thanksgiving my 3rd year in the family, when Marlene handed out the good china to set the table, and handed me the everyday plates instead, and said, without any particular cruelty in her voice, just simple, practical arithmetic, "You won't mind, Ruth. You're not really a breakables person, are you?" I took the everyday plates. I set the table. Sam never noticed, because Sam had grown up inside that particular kind of weather and thought it was just the climate. Marlene had a way of being unfailingly polite to me and never once warm, and for years I told myself That was just how some mothers are with the person who took their son. I built a whole piece out of that explanation. It held up fine, right up until it didn't. There's a thing that happens in my line of work that most people never think about. Every so often, a title comes across my desk that looks clean on the surface. All the right signatures, all the right dates, and something about it still snags. Not an error exactly, a feeling. 6 years ago, I flagged a refinance for a woman named Constance Ibarra because the notary stamp on her power of attorney was dated a Sunday, and courthouses don't notarize on Sundays. It turned out her nephew had forged the whole document to borrow against her condo while she was recovering from a stroke. I've told that story at office parties for years, usually as a kind of professional war story. Look how sharp I am. Look what almost slipped through. It never once occurred to me, not once in 6 years of telling it, that the same instinct that caught Constance Ibarra's nephew was sitting dormant in my own chest the entire time I was setting the table with everyday plates and telling myself that was just how some mothers are. I read strangers' paperwork for a living, looking for exactly the kind of quiet theft I couldn't yet see happening to me. Sam's father was different. Desmond was a quiet man, the kind who said maybe 6 sentences at a family dinner and made every one of them count. He called me Ruthie, which nobody else did, and he was the only Calloway who ever asked me a single question about my own work, my own family, my own life, before I became somebody's wife. The first summer I came up to the lake, he found me on the dock at 6 in the morning, before anyone else was awake, and instead of small talk, he asked me what a title officer actually does all day, and then he listened to the whole answer like it mattered. When I told him, half joking, that I basically spent my career catching other people's mistakes before they became somebody's tragedy, he looked at me for a long moment and said, "That's not a small thing to be good at. Most people never learn to read the thing that's actually in front of them. They read the thing they're hoping is in front of them." I didn't think much of it at the time. I think about it every day now. 3 years ago, Desmond had a bad fall off the dock ladder and cracked 2 ribs, and what should have been a simple hospital stay turned into 6 days when they found something with his heart that nobody had caught before, an arrhythmia the doctors said had probably been quietly doing damage for years. I was the one who drove up. Sam was 2 states away on a training rotation and couldn't get back for 48 hours, and somebody needed to sit in that room, so I did. Marlene came and went in tight, efficient visits, the way she did most things, always with a reason to be somewhere else 15 minutes later. Sharon came once, stood in the doorway for 6 minutes checking her phone, and left before the doctor's rounds. I was the one still there at 10 at night on the 4th day, the room dim except for the monitor light, when Desmond, propped up on pillows that smelled like hospital bleach, looked at me with a clarity that cut through all the sedation like it wasn't even there, and said, quiet and clear, "I've been watching how this family treats you for 9 years, Ruthie. I want you to know I've seen it, all of it. The plates, the cards, the way my wife thanks everyone at this table except you. I've seen every bit of it, and I never said anything, and that's on me, not you. But I've fixed something. You don't need to understand what yet. Just don't let anybody talk you out of the house if it ever comes to that." I asked him what he meant. I asked him twice. He just patted my hand, his grip weaker than I'd ever felt it, and said he was tired, and could I get the nurse? I let it go. You do that with a man recovering from heart trouble. You don't push a tired 71-year-old man toward a conversation his body clearly isn't ready to finish. I told myself he was confused, maybe a little sedated, and I filed the moment away the way you file away a strange dream. Interesting, but not something you build a plan around. I should have asked harder. That's one of the only regrets in this whole story that's actually mine to carry. Desmond recovered enough to go home, walking a little slower than before, using the porch railing more than he used to, but recognizably himself. For 2 more years, life at the lake house went on the way it always had. Summers, the whole family up on weekends, the smell of charcoal and citronella candles, Marlene running the kitchen like a small, exacting country with its own laws and its own currency. Sam's sister Sharon, unmarried, working some vague administrative job at a dental practice in town, living 20 minutes away, and coming out most Sundays, always managing to be the one who noticed if I'd brought the wrong kind of wine, or set the salad fork on the wrong side. I kept my head down. I'd learned by then that the fastest way to a peaceful weekend at Cedar Lake was to be useful, quiet, and grateful, in exactly that order, and I'd gotten good enough at it that most weekends passed without incident at all. Here is the small test the story runs on, the moment I look back on now and understand completely. 18 months before any of the real trouble started, Marlene called me on a Wednesday evening while Sam was at a work dinner, her voice warmer than usual, almost conspiratorial. "Ruth, honey, would you mind if I held on to a spare key to your place in the city? Just in case of an emergency, since you two are up at the lake so often anyway, it would put my mind at ease." I said of course. I drove it over myself that Saturday, dropped it in her hand with a little joke about how she'd better not use it to rearrange my spice cabinet, and she laughed, actually laughed, warmer than I'd heard her laugh with me in years, and for one whole afternoon I let myself believe something had shifted between us. I want to tell you I hesitated before handing over that key. I didn't. I was the daughter-in-law who'd learned to make herself small and helpful, and handing over a key felt like exactly the kind of thing a good daughter-in-law does. The kind of thing that finally earns you a seat at a table you've been standing near for 9 years. If you're the kind of person who's already sitting up a little straighter reading this, wanting to reach through the screen and take that key back out of my hand, hold that feeling. You're going to want it again before this is over. Desmond passed, 18 months later, quietly, in his sleep, on a Tuesday in early spring. The funeral was at the small stone church in town, where 3 generations of Callaways had been christened and buried, and it was, by every outward measure, a good funeral, the kind that makes you believe a life was well spent. Half the lake community showed up. A man Desmond had taught to fish 40 years earlier stood up and cried through his own eulogy. I sat in the second pew between Sam and Marlene, and I watched Marlene's face the entire service, waiting, I think, to see if any of the softness I'd glimpsed on that key handover Saturday was real grief or just good posture, and I honestly still don't know the answer. It was the ending everyone said they'd wanted for him, peaceful, at home, no long decline. I believed that too, right up until the week after the funeral, when Marlene sat at that same kitchen table, still in her black dress from the service, and said, not unkindly, more like she was simply thinking out loud, "We should really start thinking about what happens to this place now," while the flowers from the funeral home were still alive in their vases on the counter, the ribbon still tied around the largest arrangement. I didn't correct her. I didn't say a word about a conversation from a hospital room 3 years earlier that I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined. Some things, you let people finish deciding on their own before you tell them they've already lost the argument. 6 months after that, Sam deployed. He's active duty Navy, and this rotation put him on a ship for 6 months, with limited, scheduled communication, a satellite phone call every week or two if the seas cooperated and the timing lined up. I stayed in the city for work, but came up to the lake house most weekends that summer, partly out of habit, partly because I think some part of me knew that house needed a witness now, more than it needed a caretaker. The first sign something had shifted was small, a lockbox, one of those realtor combination boxes, hanging off the back doorknob on a Thursday when I came up unannounced, a week I wasn't expected. When I asked Marlene about it over the phone that night, she waved the question away with a laugh, said it was nothing, just an appraiser, just to know what things were worth these days, just in case something ever needed to be settled among the family fairly. Sharon, I later learned, had been the one to make the call to set it up. I want to be honest about something. Part of me still wanted to believe her. Grief does strange things to a family. And I told myself, Marlene was simply trying to understand what she had, now that Desmond was gone. That a widow, wanting a number attached to her own home, wasn't automatically a crime. I have read enough title histories in my career to know that most people don't set out to do something wrong. They set out to solve a problem, and then they stop asking themselves whether the solution belongs to them. The appraiser came and went without me ever meeting him. I found the printed valuation once, face down on the kitchen counter under a stack of mail, $640,000, underlined once in Marlene's careful pen. I put the mail back exactly the way I'd found it, and drove home that Sunday, without saying anything, turning the number over in my head the whole 90 minutes. I work in an office 3 blocks from a county recorder's building I've walked into 100 times for 100 other people's business, pulling deeds and liens and easements for clients who never think twice about what's actually recorded against the roof over their heads. On a Tuesday lunch break, 3 weeks after I found that valuation, I finally walked in for my own. I stood at the same worn counter I always stand at, filled out the same request form I've filled out 1,000 times, and felt, for the first time in 12 years of doing this exact task for strangers, my hands not quite steady. I pulled the recorded documents attached to the Cedar Lake property, expecting, honestly, nothing. Expecting to feel foolish standing there paying $11 for a copy of my own extended family's paperwork like I didn't trust them. I found a life estate deed, recorded 3 years earlier, the same month Desmond had been in that hospital bed. It named me, not Sam, not Marlene, me, specifically, by name, Ruth Ellen Calloway, with the right to occupy and use the property at Cedar Lake for the term of my natural life, a right that survived any future sale, any future transfer, any future owner. Underneath it, in the same filing, sat a quitclaim Desmond had executed the same week, moving his own interest in the property into a small family trust, with that life estate carved out and protected inside it like a stone set into a ring. There was a notary's seal, an attorney's name I didn't recognize from 3 counties over, and a date stamp 7 weeks after the night in that hospital room, which meant he hadn't done it in some sedated fog. He'd done it fully recovered, fully alert, driven himself to a stranger's office specifically so nobody in his own family would hear about it secondhand before it was already done. I stood in that recorder's office and read it twice, the way I read everything, and somewhere around the second read I finally understood what a dying man in a hospital bed had meant when he told me he'd fixed something. He hadn't left me the house. He'd left me the one thing that mattered more than ownership. He'd made sure that no matter who held the deed after him, no matter what anyone decided about selling or dividing or moving on, nobody could ever again make me feel like a guest in that house. I didn't tell anyone what I'd found. Not Sam. 6 weeks into radio silence on a destroyer, somewhere in the Pacific, getting maybe one short call a fortnight that I wasn't about to spend on a legal document instead of his voice. Not Marlene. Not Sharon. I let them keep planning. You don't tell people the trap they're standing in. You just watch, very calmly, to see how far they're willing to walk into it. And Marlene walked far. Over the following month, I watched from the outside of a story I already knew the ending to. She started mentioning to the ladies at her church group that the lake house was finally getting some fresh energy this year. She told a neighbor, within earshot of Sharon, over the fence one Saturday, that it was time for somebody who'd actually used the place properly, not just visited on weekends. She never said my name. She didn't have to. I understood exactly who she meant by somebody, and I let her keep meaning it. There was a Sunday dinner that summer, one of the ones I almost didn't come up for, where Marlene, 3 glasses of white wine into an otherwise ordinary evening, said, to the table generally, that she sometimes wondered if Desmond had ever really understood what that house needed going forward. He was sentimental about it, bless him, but sentiment doesn't pay the property taxes. Sharon laughed. I passed the potatoes and said nothing, and felt something in my chest go very still and very clear, the way it does right before I catch an error in a stack of paperwork that everyone else has already signed off on. Here is the part of this story I've never been able to fully explain to people who ask why I didn't just show her the deed the moment I found it. It's because a document isn't a conversation. Waving a piece of paper at a grieving widow across a kitchen table doesn't heal anything. It just wins an argument nobody was ready to have. I wanted the truth to land somewhere it couldn't be argued with later, Somewhere it would simply be a fact in the room, instead of my word against hers. So I did the one thing my whole career had trained me to do. I got quiet, and I got patient, and I gathered. Stay with me, because the part that changes everything is close now, and if any of this is landing close to home for you, go ahead and hit subscribe so you don't miss how it lands. I want to pause here and be fair to Marlene, because it would be easy to tell this story as though she were simply cold straight through, and that isn't the whole truth either. Late that same summer, before any of what's coming, I drove up on a Tuesday to drop off some paperwork and found her alone on the dock at dusk, not doing anything, just sitting in Desmond's old folding chair with her cardigan pulled tight, looking at the water like it owed her an answer. She didn't hear me come up. For almost a full minute, I watched a woman who had been married to the same man for 29 years simply grieve him with nobody performing for. And it was the only time in 9 years I ever saw Marlene without an audience. When she noticed me, she straightened immediately, smoothed her hair, and asked if I'd eaten dinner, and the moment closed over like water closing over a dropped stone. I've thought about that doc a great deal since. I think Marlene lost the one person who ever fully saw her, and instead of learning to be seen by anyone else, she decided the house was the only part of him she could still hold onto with both hands. That doesn't excuse what came next. It just means I never once told this story pretending she was simple to explain. Sam and I talked on the satellite line 9 days before the party weekend. One of maybe 6 calls that whole deployment, the connection dropping every few minutes, his voice thin and delayed the way it always was over open water. I almost told him. I had the folder sitting on my kitchen table not 4 feet from where I stood holding the phone, and I opened my mouth twice to start the sentence. Both times I closed it again. Some of that was practical. There wasn't enough time on a 2-minute call to explain a life estate deed properly, and some of it, if I'm honest, was that I didn't want the first thing Sam heard about his mother in 6 weeks to be an accusation relayed secondhand across an ocean, with no way for him to ask a single follow-up question until the next call, whenever that came. I told him I loved him, that Marlene had the house looking nice for a visit some buyers were making, and that I'd tell him everything when he got home. It wasn't a lie, it just wasn't the whole shape of the truth yet either, and carrying that unevenness alone for those 9 days was its own kind of weight. Marlene found her buyers in June, a young couple named the Faradays, newly married, hunting for their first place on the water, cash adjacent, motivated, the exact kind of buyer who doesn't ask too many uncomfortable questions about a house's history. I found out because Sharon, not thinking, mentioned it to me on a Sunday call, said Marlene had found the perfect young family and wanted to do the walkthrough properly, as a whole weekend, a real gathering, so it wouldn't feel transactional. Marlene had learned exactly one lesson from watching her late husband's family for 60 years. Dress a hard thing up as a soft occasion, and people are slower to fight it. I sat with that information for 2 full days before I did anything about it. Then I called my own office and had a colleague, a woman named Priya who's covered closings for me 100 times, pull a certified copy of the recorded life estate, the kind with the raised county seal that means something to anyone in real estate who knows how to read one. I had it couriered to my apartment instead of my office, and when it arrived, I sat at my kitchen table alone for a long time just holding it, running my thumb over the embossed seal like it was something I needed to prove to myself was real. I put it in a plain manila folder. I did not tell Marlene it existed. I did not warn Sharon, I RSVP'd to the weekend gathering, the way I RSVP to everything Marlene plans, promptly, politely, no questions asked, and I told her I'd bring a fruit tart from the good bakery downtown, because some habits of usefulness are hard to fully retire even when you know exactly what's coming. That's the second mid-story marker I want you to notice, because it matters. I chose, on purpose, to let her keep building toward a wall she couldn't see. Some people would call that cruel. I'd call it the only kind of mercy available to a family that's never once, in 9 years, given me the chance to simply say a true thing out loud and be believed the first time. If you've made it this far, and you're the kind of person who's already guessed how this ends, stick around anyway, Because the part that's coming isn't really about the document. It's about the 20 seconds right before I used it, and I've never been able to explain those 20 seconds to anyone who wasn't standing on that porch. If a family that's better at pretending than apologizing sounds familiar, drop a comment and hit subscribe, because the next few minutes are the whole reason I sat down to tell you this. The weekend arrived warm and bright, the kind of Cedar Lake weather that makes a house feel worth fighting over. Marlene had strung small white lights along the porch railing, the same lights she used to hang for Desmond's birthday every August. Sharon had made 3 kinds of pie, and I noticed, walking in, that she'd set them out on Desmond's grandmother's cake stand, the one that usually only came out for holidays. A dozen extended family and lake neighbors showed up throughout the afternoon, the kind of casual, drifting crowd that gathers at a lake house on a Saturday, whether there's an occasion or not, which was exactly the point. Marlene wanted witnesses to a happy transition, not a confrontation. She was about to get witnesses to something else entirely. I set my fruit tart on the counter next to Sharon's pies. I said hello to Marlene's church friends, 2 women I recognized from the funeral, both of whom hugged me and said how good it was to see the family moving forward. I stood on the dock for a while with a cousin of Sam's I barely knew, talking about nothing, watching a heron work the shallows near the boathouse, the manila folder sitting untouched in my canvas bag by the kitchen door the whole time, close enough to reach, far enough not to be noticed. The Faradays arrived around 4 with their realtor, a sharp, friendly woman named Marisol Ortiz who I'd actually crossed paths with once professionally, years back, on an unrelated closing across the county. She had that particular brisk warmth realtors get good at, complimenting the dock, the light through the kitchen windows, the smell of the pies. Marlene walked them through the downstairs, like a docent giving a tour of her own triumph, narrating the porch, the water rights, the excellent bones of the place, careful never to mention that her late husband had built half of it with his own 2 hands and left instructions about who got to keep it. I stood near the kitchen doorway, folder still in my bag, saying almost nothing, the way I'd said almost nothing in that family for 9 years. And that's when Marlene, walking the Faradays past me toward the porch, said the sentence she will regret for the rest of her life, in that same soft, dismissive voice she'd used on every small cruelty for a decade. "Don't mind her," she said to Marisol, tilting her head my direction like I was a piece of furniture that hadn't been moved yet. "She won't be a problem." I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body in that moment, because I've replayed it 100 times since. My hands didn't shake. My face, I'm told, didn't change at all. Something in my chest simply settled, the way it does at the end of a long shift when the last chart is finally closed and correct. I set down the glass of lemonade I'd been holding. I walked to the kitchen doorway, picked up my bag, and stepped out onto the porch. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be very clear about that, because the thing I'm proudest of in this whole story is that I never once raised my voice. Not that day, not at any point in the 9 years before it. I said, "Actually, Marlene, this sale can't close. Not today, and not with these buyers, unless someone reads what Desmond filed at the county recorder 3 years ago." The porch went quiet, in the particular way a room goes quiet when it senses, before it understands, that something has shifted underneath it. Marlene turned around slowly. Sharon, drying her hands on a dish towel in the doorway behind me, stopped moving entirely. Even the heron out on the water seemed to hold still. I opened the folder and handed the certified copy directly to Marisol, not to Marlene, because Marisol was the one whose license was actually on the line here, and professionals read documents faster than families do. I watched her eyes move down the page the way mine had in that recorder's office months earlier. "This is a recorded life estate," she said slowly, mostly to herself, running one finger along the seal to confirm it was real, and then, looking up at Marlene with an expression I can only describe as professionally alarmed, naming Mrs. Calloway, naming Ruth, for her lifetime. "I can't take these buyers through a closing on a property with an unresolved life tenancy that isn't disclosed anywhere in the listing paperwork. That's not a small oversight, Marlene. I'd be putting my license in the ground. and I'd be putting the Faradays' entire down payment at risk of a title claim 2 years from now that nobody warned them about. That deed is old business, Marlene said, and her voice had climbed half a register, the first crack I'd ever heard in it in 9 years. Desmond wasn't in his right mind that year, everyone knows that. He'd just had his fall, the doctors had him on all sorts of... He had a fall in April, I said quietly. This was filed in June, 7 weeks later. He drove himself into town, hired his own attorney, sat with a notary who wasn't anyone we know, and signed his own name in a hand that isn't shaking anywhere on this page. He was alert enough to make sure not one person in this family found out until it mattered. I only found out because I finally let myself look. Sharon spoke up from the doorway, sharper than I expected, the dish towel still twisted in her hands. You knew about this, and you let us plan an entire weekend around selling the place. You let me make 3 pies, Ruth. I found out you'd hired an appraiser off a lockbox on the back door of a house I have a legal right to live in, I said, still quiet, still level. Nobody told me anything either, Sharon. I didn't owe the family an announcement about my own legal rights, any more than Marlene owed me an announcement about listing my house out from under me. But I'll say this, I'm sorry about the pies. Mr. Faraday, standing a little apart with his wife's hand in his, cleared his throat and said, gently, that maybe they should give the family some privacy, and Marisol nodded, already reaching for her phone to make the calls she was clearly dreading. But nobody actually moved yet, because Marlene's face was doing something I'd genuinely never seen it do in 9 years. It cracked, not into tears, not yet, into something closer to a woman doing math she didn't want to do, watching a version of her future dissolve in real time, in front of 24 witnesses, and a realtor holding proof in her own hand. She turned to Sharon, in front of everyone, voice dropping to a furious near whisper that carried anyway, the way whispers do on a quiet porch. You told me the appraiser said this would be simple. You told me you'd checked. I checked the tax records, Mom. That's all I know how to check, Sharon shot back, color rising in her face. You never told me to check anything else, and I didn't know about any deed, so don't put this on me. And for one strange, almost pitiable moment, the two of them stood on that porch, not looking at me at all, looking at each other, 2 people realizing at the same time that the ground they'd been building on had never been theirs to build on. It was Sharon, a beat later, who said the thing I think she'd been carrying alone all summer, quieter now, almost to herself. I needed my third of this to cover the studio loan. I told you that in March. Marlene's face went from fury to something closer to shock, like she was hearing the actual shape of her daughter's stake in this for the first time, and I understood then that Sharon hadn't been helping her mother out of loyalty at all. She'd been counting on a check. I picked Desmond's carved wooden loon up off the porch rail where it had sat, half-finished, since the year he died, one wing still rough where his tools had stopped mid-stroke, the one Sam had set out there after the funeral, because neither of us knew what else to do with it. I held it for a second, just to have something solid in my hands, and I said the only other thing I said that whole afternoon. He told me, 3 years ago, in a hospital room, that he'd fixed something. I said, to Marlene, to Sharon, to nobody and everybody. I think what he meant was, he'd finally found a way to make sure I got to stay somewhere, for once, without having to earn it every single day. Nobody argued with that. There wasn't anything left to argue with. The gathering emptied out slowly, the way people leave a house where something true just happened. Quiet, careful not to look at anyone too directly. Marlene's church friends left first, murmuring polite goodbyes that didn't quite meet anyone's eyes. The Faradays left with Marisol, gracious to the end, Mrs. Faraday actually squeezing my hand on the way out and saying something about how she hoped they'd find a place someday with as much history as this one, minus the surprises. By evening, it was just Marlene, Sharon, and me on that porch, the small white lights coming on automatically as the sky went orange over the water, the pies still sitting untouched on Desmond's grandmother's cake stand. Marlene didn't apologize that night. I want to be honest about that too. Because this is a story about the truth, not about a tidy bow. What she did was sit down heavily in Desmond's old chair, the one nobody else really sat in, and say, mostly to the lake, "He never told me any of this. 29 years married to that man, and he never told me." I believed her. I think that was the cruelest part of what Desmond did, in his own quiet way, and also the kindest. He didn't warn his wife, he warned me. He'd spent decades learning exactly how far Marlene's version of love reached, and he'd built something that didn't depend on her ever growing past it. Here's how it landed. In the weeks and months after, Marlene withdrew the listing the following Monday, not because she wanted to, but because there was no version of a sale that didn't have to go through me now, and I made it clear, calmly, over one short phone call, that I wasn't interested in selling, not that year, maybe not ever. She asked, near the end of that call, in a voice smaller than I'd ever heard from her, whether I was planning to keep her out of the house altogether, and I told her no, that was never the point. The point was only ever that nobody got to decide that without me in the room. The Faradays, I heard later through Marisol, found a different house 2 towns over by August, closer to the highway, less history attached to it, and by every account they were glad of the trade. Sharon's studio loan, whatever exactly it was for, became her own problem to solve without a lake house cushioning the fall, and she took on a second part-time job at a framing shop that fall to cover it, which I only know because Marlene mentioned it once, almost proudly, the way you mention a child who's finally learned to do something the hard way. Sharon and I don't talk the way we used to, and I've made a kind of peace with that, the same way I've made peace with a lot of quiet distances in that family that will probably never fully close. Marlene, to her credit, never tried it again. She still calls me Ruth instead of Ruthie, still keeps that same careful distance she always has. She still, if I'm being completely honest, has never once apologized in so many words. Not directly, not the way you'd write it in a book. But the December after the party weekend, she mailed me a Christmas card, the good kind, cream cardstock with a foil-pressed pine bough, and my name was printed inside it, alongside everyone else's, not added afterward in ballpoint. I keep that card in the drawer, where I keep the certified copy of the deed, which felt, when I put it there, like exactly the right shelf for both of them. She stopped talking about the house like it was hers alone to redistribute. And some winters, in a family like ours, that's the most peace there is to be had, and I've learned to take it without asking for more than it is. Sam came home in the fall, sunburned and thinner, and full of questions I answered slowly, over several nights, the way you tell somebody a story that's too big for one sitting. He cried, a little, the first night, when I told him about his father in that hospital room. He cried harder the second night, when I finally showed him the deed itself, running his own thumb over the same raised seal I had, tracing his father's signature like he was checking it was really there. He never said a word to me, Sam said. Of course he didn't, I told him. He wasn't protecting you, he was protecting me. Those aren't the same job, and he knew exactly which one needed doing, and he knew you'd have tried to fix it out loud, and out loud was never going to work on your mother. Sam sat with that for a long time, and then he asked me, quietly, whether I'd ever forgive his mother for any of it, and I told him the truth, which is that forgiveness and trust are 2 separate accounts, and I was willing to keep making small deposits into the first one, but the second one was going to take a lot longer to rebuild, and that was allowed to be true at the same time as the first thing. We spend most weekends up at Cedar Lake now, the 2 of us, sometimes with Marlene up for Sunday dinner, sometimes not, and when she does come, the china we use is whatever's already on the shelf, no separating anymore between the breakable and the everyday. I finished the loon myself last spring, sanded down the rough wing, and sealed the whole thing the way Desmond would have if his hands had gotten the time they needed, working out on the same porch in the evenings after work, a little at a time, the way he'd have wanted it done. It sits back on the porch rail now, finished, watching the water the way he used to, and some evenings, I sit out there with my coffee going cold in my hand, in the exact spot where he always sat, and I don't think that's an accident either. Last month, I finally sat down with a lawyer of my own, not Desmond's, and had the life estate formally acknowledged inside our own family paperwork too. An extra layer, belt and suspenders, the kind of thing I do now, without waiting for anyone else's permission to protect what's mine. Some habits, once you learn them, you don't unlearn just because the crisis is over. Love that has to be earned every single day was never love. It was just a lease with an unspoken notice period, and I lived under one for 9 years without ever reading the fine print. It took a dying man's last quiet act of defiance to teach me that the people who actually love you build you something that survives the day you stop being useful to them. That's my story. One porch, one folder, one document, filed 3 years before anyone needed it, and a house on the water that finally, fully, belongs to the people who were never supposed to have to fight for it. If someone in your life only makes room for you when it's convenient for them, take this as your sign to check whose name is actually on the things that matter: the deeds, the accounts, the paperwork nobody reads twice. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.